The air inside Courtroom 302 of Cook County Circuit Court had a smell that was impossible to forget. Floor wax, old wood, and the quiet, bone-deep despair of people who had stopped believing anyone in this room would ever fight for them. Vanessa Cole sat in the third row of the public gallery and said nothing. She wore a simple charcoal blazer over a white blouse. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly. No jewelry, no designer bag. Just a legal notepad resting across her knees and a pen moving slowly, steadily across the paper. To everyone around her, she looked like a paralegal, maybe a law student, maybe just a worried relative waiting for a name to be called. She was none of those things. Vanessa Cole was a Georgetown law graduate, a former federal prosecutor who had spent a decade dismantling organized crime syndicates from the inside out. And as of 48 hours ago, she was the newly appointed chief administrative judge of the entire Third Judicial Circuit. The state Supreme Court had sent her here quietly, with emergency executive authority tucked inside her breast pocket, because the complaints about Courtroom 302 had become impossible to ignore. She had come to see if the rumors were true. Within the first 10 minutes, she had her answer. Up on the elevated bench, Judge Brian Ellis was holding court like a man who had long ago forgotten the difference between power and justice. He was in his late 50s with a ruddy complexion, thinning gray hair, and a permanent sneer carved so deeply into his face that it seemed structural. He leaned back in his large leather chair with the comfort of a man who believed no one in this room could ever touch him. He was wrong. The case before him was simple. A young black man, barely 20 years old, stood at the defense table in an oversized dress shirt, trembling. His public defender, a tired woman buried under too many cases, was explaining that her client had been late to his check-in because the public bus had broken down. He had the fine money in his hand. He was 30 minutes late through no fault of his own. Ellis cut her off before she could finish. Punctuality, he announced into the courtroom microphone, his voice thick with aristocratic contempt, is a reflection of character. And your client's character has been on display in this courtroom before. He didn't even look at the young man when he said it. Probation revoked, 30 days in county jail. A woman 2 rows ahead of Vanessa made a sound that was barely human, the boy's mother. She pressed both hands over her mouth but couldn't hold it in. The young man at the table dropped his head, and a tear hit the wooden surface in front of him. Vanessa's pen pressed harder into the paper. She was still writing when the shadow fell across her notebook. Deputy Craig Jenkins, the head bailiff, was a large man who wore his authority like armor. He had a reputation for making things physical in the holding cells when the cameras weren't watching. He stopped at the end of Vanessa's row and looked down at her the way people like him always looked at people like her, like she was something minor and easily removed. No note-taking in the gallery, he said, keeping his voice low but not low enough to be private. Hand over the book. Vanessa looked up at him with an expression of complete and absolute calm. I am taking handwritten notes, she said. The courtroom is a public proceeding. My First Amendment right to observe and record is settled law. Jenkins's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being told no, not here, not like this, not by her. I don't care what you think your rights are, hand it over or you're out. The exchange caught the attention of the bench. Judge Ellis tapped his gavel lightly and looked toward the gallery with the mild curiosity of a man who expected to be entertained. Deputy Jenkins, he said, bring her forward. Vanessa closed her notebook with a soft, clean snap. She stood without being touched, smoothed the front of her blazer, and walked down the aisle with her back completely straight. Her heels clicked against the old floorboards in a rhythm that was calm and deliberate. She stopped behind the attorney's podium directly below the bench and looked up at Brian Ellis. He looked back at her over his reading glasses like she was something stuck to his shoe. Name, he said. My name is not what's relevant right now, she replied. What's relevant is that your bailiff just attempted to seize private property without a warrant, without probable cause, and without any lawful authority. That's what's relevant. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people stop breathing. No one spoke to Judge Ellis like that. Not in 12 years, not once. Ellis's smirk collapsed, his face darkened, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something cold and deliberate. You walk into my courtroom, disrupt my proceedings, and then you stand there and lecture me about the law. I'm not lecturing, Vanessa said. I'm stating facts. The Supreme Court has upheld the right of observers to take notes in open proceedings. I caused no disruption. The disruption was caused by your bailiff. Contempt, Ellis said. Take her notebook, Jenkins, cuff her. She can spend the weekend in a holding cell and think about her manners. Jenkins moved fast. He stepped up behind Vanessa and reached over her shoulder to grab the notebook. She turned sharply, pulling it to her chest. I am advising you under federal law to step back. If you put your hands on me, you are committing assault. Jenkins laughed. It was short and ugly. I am the law in here, sweetheart. He lunged for the notebook. Vanessa sidestepped with a fluid precision that threw Jenkins completely off balance. He stumbled, his heavy boots squealing against the floorboards. Humiliated in front of his judge, in front of a room full of lawyers and court reporters and a mother clutching herself in the gallery, something inside Craig Jenkins stopped being professional. He raised his hand. The slap landed on the left side of Vanessa's face with a sound like a gunshot. The gallery erupted. A woman screamed. Attorneys jumped to their feet. The court reporter's hands flew off her machine as if burned. Ellis shouted for order, but his eyes were gleaming. Vanessa's head had snapped sideways from the force. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth where her teeth had caught her inner lip. Her vision swam for a fraction of a second. She did not fall. She did not cry out. She turned her head back to center, slowly and completely, until she was looking directly at Jenkins. The expression on her face stopped him cold. The handcuffs dangled uselessly from his fingers. Then she looked up at Judge Brian Ellis. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said quietly. The microphone carried the words to every corner of the room. Ellis scoffed, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Cuff her," he repeated. His voice didn't have the thunder it had had before. Jenkins stepped forward again, reaching for her wrist. "Stop." Vanessa reached into the breast pocket of her charcoal blazer. Jenkins's hand dropped immediately to his service weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted. She ignored him. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely without fear. From her inner pocket, she withdrew a heavy navy leather wallet. She flipped it open and set it down on the wooden podium with a sound like a judge's gavel. The golden seal of the state Supreme Court caught the fluorescent light. Below it, a platinum badge. An embossed identification card. "My name," she said, and now her voice rose to fill every inch of the room, "is the Honorable Vanessa Cole. I am the newly appointed Chief Administrative Judge of the Third Judicial Circuit. I was appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate to oversee the conduct, operations, and integrity of this courthouse." She paused, and the pause was calculated. "And as of this exact moment, Judge Ellis, you are relieved of your duties." The color left Brian Ellis's face like water draining from a bathtub. Jenkins stared at the golden seal on the podium. He looked from the badge to Vanessa, then up to the bench, and the entirety of what he had just done landed on him all at once. He had struck the chief administrative judge, in open court on the record with a room full of witnesses. "You," Ellis finally managed, his voice cracking at the edges. "This is a trick. You can't simply walk in here and I can and I have." Vanessa opened her notebook, the same notebook they had tried to take from her, and unfolded a document tucked inside it. She held it up. "This is an emergency order signed by the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, invoking the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act of 1980. It grants me unilateral authority to suspend any sitting judge in this district pending a review of extreme misconduct." She touched the corner of her mouth where the blood had dried. Then she held her thumb up so the small red stain was visible. "I came here today expecting bias," she said. "I expected cruelty toward the vulnerable. I expected arrogance dressed up as procedure. I did not expect a sitting judge to order an armed officer to physically assault a peaceful observer in an open courtroom." She lowered her hand. "You are out of control, Mr. Ellis, and your reign ends today." Ellis slammed his palms onto the mahogany desk. "Arrest her." He screamed at the two other bailiffs standing by the doors. "She's an imposter, arrest her now." Neither deputy moved. They were staring at the badge, they knew the seal, they had been trained to recognize it. And they understood with crystalline clarity that the worst thing they could possibly do in this moment was follow Brian Ellis's orders one more time. Vanessa turned to Jenkins. He physically stepped backward. "You are stripped of your courtroom authority," she said. "Place your service weapon and your badge on the defense table." Now, Jenkins's voice broke when he tried to speak. "I was just following his orders. I didn't know who you were. Following an illegal order to assault a civilian is not a defense," Vanessa said. "It is a crime, gun, badge, table." With hands that would not stop shaking, Jenkins unclipped his radio, unpinned his star, and set his firearm on the wooden table. He stepped back from it like it had become dangerous to him. Vanessa turned to the bench one final time. "Step down, Mr. Ellis." For a long moment, Judge Brian Ellis did not move. He gripped the edges of his mahogany desk with both hands, white-knuckled, staring down at the woman below him as everything he had built over 12 years collapsed around him in real time. The courtroom held its breath. Then the fight drained out of him all at once and completely. He looked suddenly like exactly what he was, an old, small, bitter man who had confused his robe for a crown. He stood slowly. He unzipped his judicial robe and let it fall over the back of the leather chair like a surrender flag. He walked down the side stairs of the bench without making eye contact with a single person in the room, and he pushed through the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom and was gone. Vanessa watched him go. Then she picked up her notebook, her credentials, and her pen. The distance from the gallery to the bench was 32 feet. She had counted it when she walked in that morning. It was a path usually traveled by the frightened, the desperate, and the condemned. Today it was something else entirely. She walked past the defense table, past the trembling form of Craig Jenkins, up the side stairs of the elevated bench step by careful step. She stood behind the desk and looked out at the room. Every face in that gallery was staring back at her. She pulled the heavy leather chair forward and sat down. She did not put on Ellis's discarded robe. She didn't need it. She reached for the microphone. "Madame Court reporter," she said, her voice settling into the room like something that had always belonged there. "Please strike the last 30 minutes of proceedings from the official record. Note a procedural reset under the authority of the Chief Administrative Judge." "Yes, Your Honor," the court reporter whispered, her fingers already moving. Vanessa looked down at the young man who was still standing at the defense table. He hadn't moved. He looked like he wasn't sure if any of this was real. "Mr. Thomas," she said gently, "please approach." He walked forward on shaky legs, his public defender beside him. "A courtroom," Vanessa said, "is supposed to be a place of law, but law without justice is just power wearing a costume." She opened the case file on the desk in front of her and scanned it quickly. "I see here that you have completed 11 months of a 12-month probation, every drug screen passed, 2 jobs maintained, a mother supported, is that correct?" The young man nodded, his voice barely made it out. "Yes, Your Honor." "The missed check-in is excused," Vanessa said, and her pen moved across the paperwork, striking Ellis's signature and replacing it with her own. "Furthermore, given your exemplary record and the treatment you endured in this courtroom today, I am retroactively terminating your probation. Case dismissed." She looked at him directly. "You are a free man, go back to your jobs, go home to your mother." The sound that came from the gallery was not applause, it was something older than that. The boy's mother had collapsed sideways into the arms of the woman next to her, shaking, weeping without sound. The young man stood in front of the bench and pressed both his hands to his chest like he was trying to hold something in. "Thank you," he managed. "Thank you, Your Honor. You're free to go," she said softly. She watched him walk up the aisle and into his mother's arms, and she allowed herself one quiet breath before she looked back out at the gallery. "Take Mr. Jenkins into custody," she said to the remaining bailiffs. Assault under color of authority, obstruction, battery. She held their gaze. The holding cells downstairs, not the administrative offices, the holding cells. They moved without hesitation. Jenkins did not fight them. The bully's bluff had been called, and what was underneath it was just a frightened man in a vest that suddenly felt very heavy. As they led him through the side door, Vanessa picked up the gavel. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "When we return, I will hear the remainder of today's docket." She looked out at every face in the room, the lawyers, the reporters, the court staff, the people in the gallery who had come here afraid. "Let it be known that the era of intimidation in this courthouse is over." She brought the gavel down. The sound of it was clean and final and absolute. Taking the bench had only been the beginning. The real work started after the gallery emptied. Vanessa moved into Judge Ellis's private chambers at the back of the courtroom and sat down at the secondary desk, not the plush armchair, the work desk, opened her laptop, and began pulling every case file Brian Ellis had touched in the past 10 years. It took 3 nights, black coffee and no sleep, and a forensic certainty that men who abused power openly were almost always hiding something much worse in private. She found the thread on the 3rd night. The pattern was not subtle once she knew where to look. Whenever a tenant faced eviction from a property owned by a shell company called Oak Ridge Holdings, Ellis ruled in the landlord's favor 98% of the time. He denied tenants their right to present a defense. He fast-tracked evictions and buried the families he displaced under maximum fines. He did it case after case after case, year after year, and nobody had ever laid it all out in a single document before. Vanessa laid it out. The forensic accountant she brought in from the state capitol pierced the corporate veil in under 12 hours. Oak Ridge Holdings was a subsidiary of a real estate trust. Sitting on the board of that trust, buried under 3 layers of LLCs and consulting agreements, was Brian Ellis's brother-in-law. The family had been collecting financial kickbacks every time Ellis cleared the way for luxury developers by removing poor minority families from their homes. It was not misconduct. It was a criminal enterprise operating out of a county courthouse. She audited Jenkins next. His internal affairs file had been stored in the basement archives and had not been touched in years. 17 excessive force complaints over 5 years. 14 of them had been dismissed without investigation, each one signed off personally by Brian Ellis. They had been a team. Ellis provided the legal cover, and Jenkins provided the fear. Together, they had turned Courtroom 302 into a machine for harming the most vulnerable people in their jurisdiction. Not anymore. Vanessa called her former colleagues at the United States Attorney's Office and walked them through the evidence binder she had assembled. The lead federal prosecutor went quiet on the other end of the phone for a long moment. Then he said, "Vanessa, this isn't just judicial misconduct. This is a RICO case. We can indict on 20 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations." "Do it," she said. "And I want a grand jury convened for Jenkins by Friday. I want them to feel the full weight of the system they weaponized." 3 weeks later, Brian Ellis sat in a secure hearing room before the State Judicial Disciplinary Board, flanked by two expensive defense attorneys who both looked nervous in a way that expensive attorneys usually don't. His tailored suit seemed to hang off him. His ruddy complexion had gone pale and sickly. The man who had ruled Courtroom 302 for 12 years looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the room. Across the table sat Vanessa Cole in her judicial robes, her posture immaculate, the faded shadow of a bruise still faintly visible across her left cheekbone. She had not covered it with makeup. The chairman of the board looked down at the stack of evidence binders Vanessa had submitted and did not look up when he spoke. "Mr. Ellis, we have reviewed the financial records linking you to Oak Ridge Holdings. We have reviewed the internal affairs files showing 17 complaints buried with your personal signature. We have seen the security footage of a sitting judge ordering an armed deputy to physically strike a peaceful observer in an open courtroom." He paused. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Ellis tried. He spoke about stress, about context, about the disruption, about not knowing who she was. His attorney put a hand on his arm before he could finish. It didn't matter. The outcome had been decided before he walked through the door. "The decision of this board is unanimous," the chairman announced. "Brian Ellis, you are permanently disbarred from the practice of law in this state. Your judicial pension is stripped effective immediately." Ellis made a sound that was painful to hear. "My pension," he said, 30 years, you can't." "You stole years from other people," Vanessa said. "You destroyed families for financial gain. You used a courtroom as a weapon." She held his gaze. "Losing your pension is the least of your concerns." The double doors at the back of the room swung open. Two agents in FBI windbreakers walked in. The lead agent stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. "Brian Ellis, you are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Ellis wept. The tyrant, the bully, the man who had sneered down from that bench at so many trembling human beings, came completely apart in front of the room that had come to hold him accountable. He was still crying when the cold steel clicked around his wrists. He looked back at Vanessa as they walked him toward the door. His eyes were wide, stunned, as if some part of him had never truly believed this moment was possible. Vanessa did not smile, she did not gloat. She simply sat there, steady and still, and let the system do what systems are supposed to do when someone finally makes them work the way they were designed. Later that afternoon, the district attorney called to inform her that Deputy Craig Jenkins had accepted a plea deal. Facing 20 years, he had pled guilty to aggravated assault under color of authority and conspiracy to obstruct justice. He would spend the next 8 years in a federal penitentiary, the same category of institution he had used as a threat against the people he abused for 5 years. The karma was not poetic, it was exact. The next morning, Vanessa walked back into Courtroom 302. The air was different. Whatever had been sitting in that room for 12 years, the invisible weight of all that fear and all those rigged outcomes and all those families sent away broken, it was gone. The gallery was full, but the murmur was different, quieter. Less like despair, more like something that wasn't sure yet whether it was allowed to be hope. Vanessa walked up the 32 steps. She sat in the heavy leather chair. She smoothed her black robe, looked out at the room, and reached for the gavel. "Court is now in session," she said. Her voice was clear and strong and entirely without performance. "Let us begin."